Morning, everybody. We're here to talk this morning about Synapse, and this is going to be a fairly kind of low-level skim across all of the things that are included in Synapse. And I kind of put this together because I've seen, a lot of presentations on Synapse, and they tend to, like, 2 minutes in, go to the so now you've got 10,000 Internet of Things devices all streaming your data, and you've got 40 terabytes of data already in there, and here's a really cool report. Which it can definitely do that, and it's kind of cool to show off. But if you're like me and you come from a little bit more of a, relational database background, and you hear a lot of the marketing terms thrown around Synapse, I like to just kind of see what can it actually do. And we're not gonna look at large sets of data today, but I'm gonna go through all the various pieces of Synapse and kind of show what it is and why it's going to be used more and more as people are building a modern data warehouse. So with that, we'll kind of get going here. Usually this first slide is, I like to have a what is slide, but for Synapse, I took a second and I put in a which Synapse Analytics slide. If you've gone out and looked at the Azure resources, you may have seen if you type in Azure Synapse, you get two different things. The second bullet point here is the one that's been around a little bit longer. Azure Synapse Analytics, formerly SQL Data Warehouse. And this is sort of the one that people tend to think of when they think of Synapse Analytics. And it's definitely, I think, when I'm talking to people, this is the piece that I usually mean right now when I say we're going to use Synapse Analytics as a solution, because Data Warehouse is more of a known solution than the workspace overall, although it's changing quickly. But today we're actually going to talk about this first one, Azure Synapse Analytics Workspaces Preview. Now, the thing to know there is that the Workspaces Preview includes the SQL Data Warehouse solution within it. So even though they're two different resources, when you create a Workspaces Preview, you still get the SQL Data Warehouse. That piece is included in there with all of the other pieces that come with it. And again, we're gonna look at the whole picture, not just the one piece of SQL Data Warehouse. And I'll probably go back and forth calling it Synapse Analytics, SQL Pools, and SQL Data Warehouse, just because it's still new enough that people have used SQL Data Warehouse. One thing to point out, that the only piece of this that is out of public preview right now is the piece that was formerly Data Warehouse, right? And that's because this was, at the time it was rolled out, it was essentially rebranding of Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and with some modifications to actually make it more performant under the hood. But in general, they needed to provide a path forward for that, and that was the immediate path forward. So, all that said, what is Synapse Analytics? It now includes all of these pieces. The first one being SQL Pools, that I kind of threw out there a second ago, which is the SQL Data Warehouse piece of it. This is a SQL Pool within the Synapse Workspace, is a multi-parallel processing columnar store data warehouse. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second. It also includes a built-in SQL pool, also called SQL on Demand or Serverless, which allows you to use SQL compute engine to run queries against data or information in a data lake. It doesn't, much like a lot of the other compute solutions, you can't actually, the built-in SQL pool doesn't store data. It uses compute to process data that lives in other places. We'll look at how that works a little bit. All of this sits on top of Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. So when I say SQL Pool Serverless reads data from from data that's already sitting out there, this is going to be in the data lake. And whether that's in a Parquet format or even in CSV, it can read directly from the files and pull in using that SQL language that we all know. The SQL Pools, the data warehouse, the files for that also sit in data lake storage, but that isn't something you can access directly without going through the SQL Pool. It's it's a proprietary file store, but it does use data lake storage to store all those files. Also included is Spark compute pools. And this is sort of where, there's probably a couple of different types of attendees for this event. Some people coming from more of the traditional data warehouse, and maybe they know that side of it, or Azure Data Warehouse, and they've seen that before. And other folks maybe coming from that have used tools like Databricks. This isn't exactly Azure Databricks. They do both use the Spark compute engine, and they both have a lot of the same functionality, and that you can use multiple languages to access the data, Scala and Python and whatnot. But it's not the same Databricks as the Azure Databricks, and it's not the same Spark. Sorry, it's not the same Spark installation as Azure Databricks. Databricks has created sort of a proprietary version of Spark, and I imagine we'll see. I think currently the Spark cluster in Synapse Workspace is the open source, one of the latest open source versions. We might see that become more proprietary as they do more with it. I haven't pushed it too hard, but I haven't really encountered anything that I couldn't do in, at least as far as Spark's concerned, in the Synapse Spark compute pool that I couldn't do in Databricks. Now Databricks comes with a couple of add-ons like the file system and things like that, but they're pretty comparable at this point. Slightly different solution design. And the last piece of it is integrate. And that is basically Azure Data Factory. And if you've used Azure Data Factory, it's going to look very familiar when we kind of pop into it. So with that said, I kind of want to, we're going to jump back and forth a little bit. There's not a lot of slides. I want to actually show what Synapse looks like and the various pieces of it, and we're going to kind of take a bit of a tour through the entire workspace. Oh, and I want to point out, kind of while I'm doing this, I can't, just the way my screen's configured, I can't see the list of questions coming through as they come through. We'll take a pause a couple points, but if you got questions, definitely throw them in there. And if we don't get to them before the end, we can follow up via email, or I'll kind of go back through them as well. But so with that said, let's kind of jump in and just real quick to show how we would create a workspace. So we're not going to create one. I already have one that exists, but if I put in Synapse, you can see right away that we have, clicked off the screen. You can see right away that we have, here's the one I was talking about, Azure Synapse Analytics, formerly SQL Data Warehouse. And if all you need is that piece, that is still available. I imagine that's going to migrate eventually to always be included in the workspace. And if you create it, you can then add it into the workspace later, but there is a little bit of sort of tweaking you have to do that. But the one we want to look at is the Workspaces preview. And we're going to go ahead and click create here, and we'll stop before we actually get there. So what do you need to create this? You have to have a subscription, put it in a resource group, have to give it a name. It has to be unique and all lowercase. Choose your, now you do want to, if you're going to use, depending on where your storage is, you're definitely going to want to put that in the same, put this workspace in that same region. And you can use an existing data lake storage. If you're doing this greenfield, I'd probably recommend that you just go ahead and create a new one here and tie it in. Now I have one that's sitting out there that I'm just going to put in here as we're looking at this. Creating the new one and tying it in directly here just sets up some of the security pieces automatically. Again, those are things you can go back and set up afterwards, but doing it here makes it a little bit easier. So if we look at the next piece, and the next piece, so The other piece that you want to do when you're setting it up is this is the SQL admin user. Now you have all these various components of the Synapse Workspace, but two of those are SQL based, right? First you have your SQL Pools, and then you have the Serverless SQL. And those are going to need a SQL admin user so that you can connect initially and set up other users. I think I'm using not an enterprise subscription here. So what it does is it also sets me up as the Azure Active Directory admin as well. When I do this automatically, it just assigns that to the user setting it up. But that could be changed after the fact as well. But you do want to set up an admin for the SQL Server. And this again is sort of, if you've used Azure SQL Data Warehouse or you've used Azure SQL Database, when you create those, you also create an admin username. And you have essentially, this is at the server level, right? So with Azure SQL Database, you have a virtual sort of SQL server that you put databases underneath. And this is sort of the same thing. We're going to have a virtual server when we create a SQL pool, and it needs to know what the admin's going to be. So when you go and create SQL pools in the future, it won't ask you again what the admin is for that SQL pool server. It'll use this default one you've set up here. And again, you can change that, and obviously you can add different roles in and different users in after the fact. So we're not gonna create this. We're gonna kind of just go right into the one that we already have. And you can see I do have a dedicated SQL pool that I've created before. That is included in this workspace, but it is listed. We can look at the resource separately, but we're gonna go right into the workspace. All right, and this is the Synapse Workspace resource. So you actually use the workspace various tools in the Synapse Studio, and if you've used Data Factory, or Databricks, this is kind of a similar. You have your resource with all of the configurations for the resource, and then you do the development in a workspace. So you can see when I set this up, I did set up a slightly different admin username. And some of the things to look at here is, again, you can change that Active Directory admin, various properties for the different managed object ID. When you're connecting in, you're going to need some of these things if you're connecting in from outside sources or using an API. You can see the SQL pools that are listed here, and I have the built-in, which is serverless, and then I've created this SQL pool, and I turned it on right before we started because you do pay while it's running. And we have a Spark pool that I created as well, so we can run Spark notebooks, and you can have various different pools at different sizes and different configurations, sort of like you can in other Spark systems. This one is set very low just because this is a demo environment. But again, if you have like dev Spark pool for people just to kind of run scenarios, and then you might have a more robust one for production. All right. And then, like I said, all of this is really done in the Synapse Studio. And if you've used Azure Data Factory, this should look slightly similar design pattern. You come into the studio and you've got some various links and whatnot, and then down the side you've got all of your different areas of actually working. And just kind of show real quick, you've got a list of the databases. This is the dedicated SQL pool, and this is our serverless one. I wish I'd named them slightly different now that every time I look at them, I think that. And then you also can see your storage. This is the default storage we set up when we came in here. And I've already got some things in there. So you've got a develop section with various ways of you storing SQL scripts, notebooks for Spark, and actually you can develop data flows outside of Azure Data Factory and then include them in pipelines after the fact. And we are going to dig into all these. I just kind of want to show everything that we have first. You have the ability to monitor. So just like in Azure Data Factory, you have the ability to monitor pipeline runs. You have the ability to look at your SQL requests. And this is essentially coming from DMVs that are on the SQL Data Warehouse, or sorry, the SQL Pool. And I think they're even the PW or PDW dynamic views that have been around since then. And I think this is exec requests that we're looking at right here. And these are all on the built-in, and it's just sort of standard one-off queries that I've run, not a lot going on there. And then data flow debug, where you can actually step through the different data flows, but you can do that directly from the data flow. I haven't run anything yet since I've flushed that cache. And you also have management, and here you can manage the SQL Pools start or pause. And like I said, that one is started. Same with your Spark pools. Linked services, which again will look familiar to those that have used Azure Data Factory. And here, so when you create your Synapse Workspace, these two are automatically created. You get your default SQL Server, which this is the SQL Server for the Serverless, and you get your default connection for your data lake storage, which we saw when we were looking at the file structure. And you can set up triggers, so you can trigger jobs. You can have various integration runtimes, and much like, and I'm not going to dig too much into this, but again, if you've used Azure Data Factory, you can create a self-hosted runtime to link to on-prem data. It has, I think there's a few limitations in the Synapse version of that right now, but it's pretty much the same thing. I think the one limitation I know of off the top of my head is that you can't have a shared integration runtime. It's just for this one workspace. And then I do want to mention access control. This is a secondary step in Synapse Workspace. In addition to having access to the resource, you have to give people access to the workspace. So you would have to come in here and set up, your Azure Active Directory group for the people that you're going to allow in here, and you can set up various roles within the workspace, workspace admin, SQL admin, or Spark admin. And we're not doing anything credentials today. So that's kind of a really high level overview. And kind of what we're going to do is we're going to flip back and forth between I got a couple slides to outline some of the features of each part of that, and then we're going to go actually kind of poke around and look at a few things. So first one, and this is the big one in here, right? So it's kind of easy to talk about because it's the one most people understand, but there's not a lot, there's not as much, I suppose, unknown for a lot of folks on this one. You've been using SQL Server maybe, or you've been using SQL Data Warehouse already. This is that solution. And as I said, it came out of Parallel Data Warehouse, which used to be an appliance that you had to put in your own data center and run this sort of massively parallel processing data warehouse solution that stores column store index. It's the solution for data that large amounts of data that you want to aggregate versus a transactional database. And this is a type of solution that's been around for a while. And it's, more and more the modern data warehouse architecture is sort of a hybrid, but having this piece embedded in it means that you have access to that sort of actual data warehouse within all of these other pieces. And when I say actual data warehouse, just because that's what I think about still. But that parallel DW became Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and that is now provisioned SQL Pools within Synapse. And it has grown as they've moved it. And actually, it was sort of a natural fit to be moved into the cloud, because even when it was an appliance, it was essentially a huge amount of servers all running in parallel so that you could split out your data on various disks and various compute nodes. And what is Azure in the cloud, but really just a bunch of servers that you can parallelize things on, right? So it's a pretty good fit. One way, if you're to think about this, is if you're familiar with solutions like Snowflake or Redshift. Those are also MPP data warehouses. Each of these sort of has different use cases, I think, and various things you can look at. The SQL one obviously gives you all of the Microsoft components with the SQL Pools, but the way it is set up under the hood is you have one control node and multiple compute nodes, up to 60 different compute nodes. And each compute node is, just for pricing, is 500 data warehouse units. Again, I throw that on there if you've used SQL Data Warehouse. The smallest you can have is only 100 data warehouse units, and that's sort of, it's not actually a full compute node, it's a slice of a single compute node up to 500, and at that point you can only go up in 500 increments. You can only add after that first node, and those are really for sort of dev situations, or demo in this case. You wouldn't want to run anything in production that was under 500 with that one, at least get you one full compute node. And the data is actually distributed on disk in 60 different files so that it can read in parallel, and you can distribute the data out various based on how you want to set up the tables. You can do sort of a round robin solution, or you can do a hash key and partition on that, as well as you could even do replication if it's a small enough table and you don't want to have to say it's if you're thinking of sort of that star schema, it's a small dimension you're joining to a fact, you could have that dimension table on every distribution and not have to read across anything to join it to the larger tables, which is nicer for the smaller tables. So I've said this a couple times, the standalone of this right now is the only piece that we're talking about today that's not in preview. And it is in public preview and everything's pretty robust, but what that means is the SLAs aren't going to be the same as general availability resources, right? So there are definitely people using this already for their solutions, but it is something to be aware of. Provisioned SQL pools are billed by the hour. So when it is up and running, you are paying for it. And it can be, at the smallest level, it's, that's going to be like, a couple dollars an hour. And at the larger levels, it could be, over $500 an hour, which is going to, cost you money over time, but you only have to have it on when you want to use it, as well as that it can get expensive, but it is a pretty impressive solution for those large scales of data. Like, I mean, you're turning, if you're using sort of traditional relational databases or even NoSQL databases, and you're running through terabytes or petabytes of data, you've got processes that are taking hours or days that are going to run in a fraction of that time. So you kind of get what you pay for. T-SQL, the SQL language that we're all used to if we're using SQL Server. And again, this is really more for large data sets. And I should point out, we are not going to look at large data sets today. I kept a very simple data set, I think it's about 4 records, just to showcase what some of the capabilities are of how things work versus how quickly they work. And again, this is the solution for creating an actual data warehouse that you want to process large amounts of data. You're maybe going to put it into that star schema, and it's a good part of the hybrid solution, right? It's sort of, I'm kind of going through the process backwards by starting with the provisioned SQL pool, because that's sort of the end result. If you're building that data warehouse, you've got data that you're taking from all your various sources, whether it's streaming data from Internet of Things, or it's your transactional applications, and sort of you dump everything into your data lake from all your various sources. Then you massage it, you do some transformations, and ultimately you get it into this data warehouse where you can run really fast analysis and really fast queries. This is sort of the end point of all that. But let's take a look at it. And again, I kind of come into this thinking that, at least from my perspective, using the using SQL is sort of a known thing, right? So we've got a table out there, and this is just a staging table that we've dumped these episodes, and we're going to show later how I got this data in there. And right from here, you can just say, let's select top 100 rows. And since I queried from that table, it created the correct SQL pool, and I've got a master and a database, the one database out there. And I've just got a couple of records of some various Star Trek episodes, and this is actually reading the source data is a couple of tables that's been migrated into this one table. So there's not really a whole lot to show here. We can SQL, the T-SQL you know and have used for SQL database or for SQL Data Warehouse works with SQL Pools. It is essentially that. You can also connect using various tools. I'm using Azure Data Studio here, but you can use SQL Server Management Studio and just create that connection just like you would anything else. So you've got the server name, and this is the workspace name, SQL Azure Synapse.net. So similar to connecting to other database resources in Azure. And we are doing a SQL login, and the database was this Synapse 101 SQL pool, and I created a server group locally. That's nothing. And we're able to connect and run queries from other tools. So we are going to look at this again, but like I said, I've kind of started at the end. When we've gone through some of the other tools, I'm going to show how we can create an external table in this SQL pool to connect to the data directly in the data lake and pull that in. But for now, let's kind of go on to talking a little bit about, this is maybe the more interesting case and maybe the less familiar one. It certainly was for me before I started working on these tools. You have the built-in serverless SQL pool, as opposed to the other one that is billed for per every hour that it's running. This one is only billed for the amount of data that you read, and that is, all of your data can. And again, and I said this when I was outlining at the beginning, there is no data in this serverless SQL, right? It's a pass through to use a SQL compute engine to query data that's sitting in your data lake. But you are able to use that same T-SQL language that we're familiar with. And I put ad hoc on here because it is really good for sort of ad hoc cases if you know what that underlying data is, right? You can go out and map to files and run a query and bring in to, bring it into the workspace and run some queries on it, and you can pull in data from a data lake, whether it's in Parquet or CSV. And also using Synapse Link, you can read data directly from Cosmos DB. And I also, right now, you can't, from SQL Pool using the serverless compute, you can't read from your SQL Pool source, like your permanent SQL Pool. But I believe that is coming, so that you can get some sort of cross database queries. Don't hold me to that though. But not only just that ad hoc piece, you can also use this if you're running queries as part of a process, right? So you can have a job setup that's, instead of reading data in your provisioned SQL pool, you can read data directly from your data lake using SQL Compute and have that set up as an ongoing part of the process as well. Like I said, we are going to kind of jump back and forth. So we're going to get rid of that. And if you saw that publish thing, if you've used Data Factory, it's very similar to that. If you make any changes, you do need to go and then publish them. So if we look here, we're going to go into our develop, and we're just going to look at a simple SQL script. So this is using built-in. And for this one, I do have a database that I've created in the built-in. And to look at that database, you'll see that there's no actual tables. You can map external tables, you can create views, but you cannot create any tables in the database. So it doesn't, for this purpose, I'm hitting the Parquet file directly. So there's really no need to choose a database for this, because I'm not using any particular database. And if I run that, it's going out and it's reading this Parquet file, which has that same information that ended up in the table staging table we were looking at a minute ago. And this this tool I just flipped over to is Azure Storage Explorer, and this basically shows my blob storage container in my data lake, and I've got a folder called demo, and I've got a Parquet file called episodes. Parquet file is just a column store file format that's sort of become the de facto default for Spark, and because a lot of this under the hood is using Spark, that's what I'm using for my SQL pass-through as well. And you could, this open row set should look pretty familiar, just using Polybase to connect to a file and read it in, giving it the format of Parquet. So now again, this is using the built-in SQL, so there's no SQL server running for this, just the SQL compute that we need. But what you can do, sorry, this is what I want. So before I mentioned it didn't really matter what database I was looking at, but I do have a database in my serverless, and I went in and created a view with that same query. And now, so because querying that information required you to know where those files were, how to access it, but now you can set up a view for your users that come out here and want to run queries against it, and they don't need to know where those are. You could also set up an external table, but I mean the external table would essentially be the same query, and doing the view is a little bit one less step of creating the external data source. So, and this all gets you access to the same information, but you can kind of see the different ways to pull information in. All right, we're gonna flip back over. So Spark Pools, again, this is not Databricks, but it is it is using the same Spark compute clusters that Databricks is built on, and you can do a lot of the same things. Notably, you can have notebooks using all these different languages: Python, Scala, R, SQL. Yep, SQL, and we will actually look at using SQL in a Spark notebook here in a second. But you see I've highlighted there C#, which I think is going to be a differentiator. I still tend to go towards a Python just because that's what I've been using for the last year or so. But having C# in there is something I'm going to have to start looking more at, because using Microsoft tools for Microsoft tools is always a nice synergy usually. This is billed per cluster uptime. So when you kick something off that's using the Spark pool, you're going to start paying for it, and you can set it up to auto shut down within a certain time. And so if you're running various processes and you want it to stay up, you can tell it to stay up. Otherwise, it'll shut down after a certain time, and you'll stop paying for it being up. And I added a bullet point for machine learning here, basically just to kind of, again, sort of the use case. The Spark Pools is the serverless SQL is a great use case for sort of ad hoc looking at what you're going to be doing, but the Spark Pool, having this all in the same workspace, because you're going to have, if you're processing a lot of data, you're going to have data scientists and people building machine learning algorithms on your team, and they might be more comfortable using Python or Scala to come in here and just transform and parse the data and build those robust things. And they, not necessarily going to care about that there's a SQL data warehouse running. If they can connect all the data through the notebook and get what they want and build that, and then that process can become a part of it all, and feed into something. Say they come out here, they build a scoring algorithm that scores data, dumps it back into the lake, and then from the lake we can bring it into our data warehouse and run quick reporting off of very large amounts of data that's been scored, probably quickly using the Spark compute. So, and I know I'm kind of going through a lot of this quickly, but we're about to hit a pause, I think, because I don't think I started my Spark cluster. But let's go look at our notebook. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start that while I'm talking. So this is using the Spark cluster that I created before we went in here. And it's a pretty low level Spark cluster. And we can look at the configurations here in a second. And I chose Python. The other languages, as I mentioned, sorry, I can't change it while I'm running. R, SQL, C#, Scala. So this first step here, basically I'm just sort of parsing together the path to where the data is, and it's the same path that was in here. It's basically building this same path and then reading that into a PySpark data frame. So, all right, kind of while that is starting, and then we're going to manipulate the data in Python in that data frame. While that is running, I'll kind of look through and see if there's any questions. Sorry, the way my screen's lit, I've got a couple of different monitors here. Pulling that up it's like blocked on half. I apologize. So a couple questions in there. Is Synapse Analytics also an Azure Data Warehouse like Azure Synapse? If I'm understanding the question, I probably have hit that already. That was kind of early on, right? Yeah, so Azure Synapse Analytics is Azure Data Warehouse. You might have also have heard it just called Azure Synapse, but they're all the same thing. There is no more Azure Data Warehouse, right? It's been rebranded to Azure Synapse Analytics. And the other question, and again, I think this one may have been answered already, is this being recorded? And yes, it is definitely being recorded. And I think they said they will be sending that out by noon tomorrow or afternoon tomorrow. So. And again, it's kind of technology. The question pane for me is like half on my screen and half off. Those are kind of at the top, and those are the ones I can see. So I apologize if there's other ones. We'll get to them at some point. We'll be able to see them as we wrap up here. So that is still running. So let me do what I just promised, which is let's go in and. When I said we have a very small SQL pool or Spark pool that I'm running, and that's based on the node size. So, and the minimum is 3 nodes. So, and with auto scale, you can tell it to run from three up to, I don't know what the upper scale is. It's not 60 as well as the, let's see, 200. That's okay. I was going to say 256, but I'd been wrong. So the minimum you can have is 3. And then each of those nodes will be, have this many CPUs or in this much memory. So the small one is cheaper, obviously, large one. And much like the SQL pools, it can get expensive, but the processing power you get for that, and you only have to have it running when you need it. So if you've got something that's churning through a ton of data, you can come in and scale things up, run it on different, create a Spark cluster that's got a ton of resources, run it on that cluster, and then delete the cluster if it's a one-time thing, or if it's once a month, just use that expensive cluster when you need to. So let's go back and see if we've got, yes. So Our notebook first step here is finished reading in. So we went out and read that file into a PySpark data frame. And this is sort of the piece, like, I think I mentioned this at the top of the hour, that, you have people who come from two backgrounds into this. You've got people who've come from that more SQL Server background. You've got people that come from that data scientist, Python background. And so if this piece is new to you, do feel free to throw some questions in there. But you can see that this ran a job to pull in, and I've got, those 8 cores because I've got the smaller nodes. And then this is just a PySpark command to display that data. And again, it's going to be those same 4 records. Putting this together, dealing with so much data all the time, I was like, well, I don't want to get bogged down in the data, which is kind of the opposite of a lot of things I do. But so we've got those 4 records, and you can kind of, because it's in a notebook, you can do a quick chart, and it did like a count. There's 2 episodes here and 2 episodes there. But you could also, that's just in a chart, but say you wanted to actually, do a transformation that does that same count aggregation. You can run some more PySpark and say, okay, group by the series name and do a count. And it'll pull back the data that way. Same chart, but this information could then be written somewhere, and we'll do that in a second, assuming we have time. I do also want to point out, this is sort of, if you're not as familiar with PySpark, you do have the ability to use SQL in these notebooks, because you can change languages for each different cell, and we can take that Python data frame and create a temp view that can be accessed through SQL. And just kind of show you, these are called magic commands, and you can change languages on the fly for each cell. And for this one, we've told it to use SQL, and now I've got that select statement that I can just run. And now we're back to that comfortable SQL that we all like. So that was a strict select, and now this bottom one, if you're more familiar with SQL, this command, this query should look pretty straightforward, doing that count. And again, so this SQL command is doing the exact same thing as this Python, but allows you to use SQL to pull data if that's what you're more familiar with. And there are some things you can do with the Python, and certainly if you're more familiar with Scala, reading in data with Scala can be a little bit more performant, but these are essentially exactly the same under the hood. It's just using a more comfortable language. So I saw a couple other questions come in. Can Synapse replace SSAS? So can Synapse replace this? I mean, so you could combine it with some tools to maybe replace it. You're not going to get the same sort of, if you're using those, an analyst SQL analytics cubes. Wow. To really churn through the data you've got set up in those models, you could definitely, if you have the chops to do it all in Scala and Python, get some similar results reading the data directly from the data lake, but you're not going to get that nice crisp data model unless you build it, right? You could you could put that all in here and have it formatted into a model that reads quickly, but it's just kind of where you want to put the work. The next question, will Azure Synapse SQL Pool replace Azure Analysis Services? There's no, those are sort of the same question, right? No, it's not going to be replacing Azure Analysis Services. I could see some path in the future where they incorporate that, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Would Databricks still fit in this architecture, or could we replace existing Databricks with Synapse? So this is a question that comes up a lot. Databricks, there's slightly different use cases, right? So Databricks has a proprietary Spark cluster, which is actually a little bit more performant in some cases, as well as they've put some work into making the Delta Lake scenario work really well. You can also do a Delta Lake in Synapse and create those Delta Lake tables here as well in the data lake. But they've built sort of a layer on top of that to make it easier to access. I do think that as Synapse continues to grow, again, it's still in preview, right? As Synapse continues to grow, they're going to add some more of those features in. There are definitely things in Databricks that make it worth using still. Azure Databricks, of course. And but the big advantage you get of switching over to using the Synapse Spark cluster is everything's in one place. And you also may have seen, like, I didn't have to do anything. There's no security. The security is kind of baked in as well, like connecting from here to the data lake. There's no certificate or anything. It knows, it's able to pass through my user and take in that. There's another question on here. Why is it taking so long to run? It's taking so long to run because a lot of these things are the first time that I've kicked off this Spark cluster, and I have everything dialed down really low because it is just for demo purposes. Another question on here, is there a community version of Azure free service like Databricks offering? So if you have a subscription, I think you can go and set it, but you are going to have to pay for it. It's not going to be free. And you could, not turn things on and just kind of poke around. Yeah, the comment on here was Synapse could be expensive, and that is true. Synapse can be expensive, and it's not intended for like a small solution, right? It is meant to be an enterprise level solution for churning through, terabytes or petabytes of data. And another question, can we browse the data without expensive compute clusters? So, I mean, you can browse the data through the serverless cluster, and you can browse the data through just, running the smaller Spark clusters, I guess, which aren't as expensive. And the last question, and I sort of switched over to the questions because I've touched on a lot of the points that I wanted to. If we are going to have a little bit of time, I'm going to go through a data flow as well, which I think is pretty slick. But I wanted to make sure I got to these. So did they just rename Azure Synapse to Synapse Analytics? Yeah, those are kind of all the same thing, right? I don't even know that they renamed it. I think it's been Synapse Analytics since the beginning. It just wasn't always stressed as much. Okay. So the last piece that we haven't talked about, and like I said, I wanted to do those questions because those were good questions. Sorry, on sort of the pieces we've covered. And the very last piece, if you've used Azure Data Factory, then this is going to look very familiar. It does have some special tasks that are just specific to Synapse, like running a Spark job or running a Synapse pool stored procedure. And also it uses data flows similar to Azure Data Factory, and kind of wanted to point out that those data flows are another place where Spark is used in Synapse. It uses Spark clusters under the hood to run those data flows. And before we jump back in, because we probably won't come back to the slides, this is, I went out and I like this picture a lot because it kind of shows it. I don't know who to attribute it to, unfortunately. I did a quick search for images, and I think this one's been shared around a lot, but this piece here is the piece that people think of when they think of Azure Synapse. This is the SQL DW, and when it was rolled out, this was, I think, Microsoft wanted to be sure that people knew SQL DW wasn't going away, and Synapse was going to be the replacement for it. But Synapse is actually all of this, right? particularly if you go into the studio, all of these pieces are there. You have the monitoring, the management we looked at. It all sits on top of Data Lake, and you have Azure Data Factory, Spark Pools, and SQL On Demand. So I do like that slide, and if somebody knows who put it together out in the community, I'll give them credit. So let's go back over into the demo. And I kind of want to look at some of the, we're not going to publish anything right now. So we have our pipelines. And if you've used Data Factory, this is going to look really familiar. Like I said, here's those extra Synapse ones, and you do still have access to even, if you're still using Databricks as your Spark component, you can incorporate that here as well. So we have the source, and this is just a SQL database, an Azure SQL database I have running out there that's got those 4 records that we've been seeing this whole time. Well, actually, it's a view in that database. There's actually 2 tables that are normalized because we've got repeating information here. So I created a view for these 4 records, and this is in a SQL database, regular SQL, Azure SQL database. Pulls in those records, and then we're writing them to our Parquet data file. And that you can see is using our default storage, our Synapse default storage, and just got a path exactly to that file. And it's going to overwrite, and you can set this up, if this is part of your process, you can set it up to run whenever using triggers. I just kicked it off right now, and then we can go monitor it here. Again, if you've used Data Factory, this should look familiar. We can come in here and we can look, and it's already done. So moving data that way is pretty quick. Writing to the data lake. And it is kind of a small amount of data, right? So we can see we read 4 rows, we wrote 4 rows. Now, we can also look at data flows. And these are using Spark clusters to run. So if I wanted to debug it here, I'd have to turn on the debug, which would start up a Spark cluster under the hood. I'm not going to do that just this second. So what the data flow allows us to do is, this is sort of the codeless version of the other, I set this up to do the same things that we were doing before. And, sorry, I apologize. Something else come in. We're reading in from that Parquet file. It's the same source. Pull that up. Then we're doing an aggregate, and if you're familiar with data flow, you can do all sorts of transformations here. And this is where it's pulling in the data, and it's using a Spark cluster, Spark compute to do this aggregation, group by series name, do a count, and then we're going to write it out to just another file. So we've created a Parquet out, which is just in a different one. And the nice part about data flow, though, is say we wanted to write it out again to somewhere else, we could just do that. If we want, do all of our transformations, write it out, we're going to transform it again. We've got 2 different, this is a very simple use case, but maybe you've got some scoring algorithms you're going to do, and you're going to write out, 1 score and then another score. It's all built in there. So again, you could debug this and actually run this right from here. But we're going to go and run it from here. Basically, I set up another pipeline with a data flow task, and we can run that. I kind of wanted to run that to show. Go ahead and look. And this one is going to take a little longer than the other one because, again, it has to start up that Spark cluster. but you can see it while it's running. So I don't know that we've only got a couple minutes here, but I did want to kind of show that piece of it as well. And I know like we kind of jumped around a lot, but this is sort of, like I said, that tour of Synapse. When people hear Synapse, and it, you know, it even came up in the questions a couple times, you know, what is the name Synapse actually mean? And it kind of means all of this, right? Now, for sure, when I'm having conversations and I say, oh, you know, this looks like it'd be a good solution for Synapse Analytics, I'm usually meaning the data warehouse component. All of these other pieces just tie into like a complete solution for modern data warehouse. Because if you're building a warehouse these days, it's typically not going to be just a SQL solution, even if that's, you know, SQL Data Warehouse or now SQL Pools. That is a great solution for a ton of data for when you know you're going to process it. But all these other pieces, I mean, things move. You know, if you're doing analysis on sets of data, this gives, you know, your data scientists and your data engineers a place to kind of just go in and move things around and run things, and then you can turn those into automated processes. So that while that's running, and we've got a couple more minutes, when should we use PySpark versus Spark SQL? That's sort of it's almost sort of a preference, right? If you're more familiar with PySpark and running those Python commands, you're probably going to end up doing less code. It might be a little more dense and harder for those of us who like SQL to read through it. Spark SQL, again, you know, once you've got it in those views or tables, you can just go like you're used to writing. So, but it is really a preference. Under the hood, it's doing the same thing, pulling the data in from the data lake and partitioning it. You know, that's what Spark works similarly to the SQL compute when it's, you know, distributing everything and running it on multiple nodes. And then the last question in here is Azure Data Factory under the hood using Spark cluster? Azure Data Factory itself, like when you're looking at like the copy commands or the you know, some of the other components, that is using a runtime engine, just a compute engine. The data flow in Azure Data Factory, yes, it's using Spark under the hood to do all of the because it actually has to do compute while this is running, right? Like a copy in, you know, your typical design pattern in Data Factory before they added in data flow was you copy data from one place to another. You might be able to run some code, but you're running that code on the SQL Server, or you're running that code on Databricks, or you're running, you know, you weren't running any code within Data Factory. So being able to, you know, do transformations and pull data into memory, this is all running on a Spark cluster, yeah. So that kind of gets us to the top of the hour. There's some pretty good questions in there. I'm always glad to see people are thinking about things and wondering about this. If you have more questions, let's see if I can get back to the slide. Hey, look again. Feel free to reach out to me. I'll leave this slide up. It'll be part of the recording, obviously, but I'll leave it up for the last minute here. That's my Twitter handle at the bottom and email address. You can also, you know, you can obviously reach out to 3Cloud directly. And if you have any other questions on Azure Synapse or Azure Data Solutions or Azure in general, I guess now that we're 3Cloud, feel free to reach out to us. So I think with that, I will wrap up, and I'm sure the emails will go out for the recording, and thanks everybody for coming.
All right. Thank you, everybody. It looks like, I don't think there's any more questions. Let me see. Oh, look, there's a couple.
Oh, did more come in? Okay.
Yeah. Hold on one second. Let me. There's a film. There's about 4 more.
Well, I don't want to go too far over, but yeah, I can run through these real quick. Can we just use Spark SQL since most of the SQL developers want to use PySpark? Yeah, no, like I said, they're pretty interchangeable. If you're more familiar with the using SQL, putting it in those tables and just running SQL is definitely a way to go. Is data flows available outside of Synapse? Yes, data flows is available with Azure Data Factory currently. Can we just use Spark SQL since most of us probably SQL developers? Yeah, yep. Definitely. And again, you know, that's also what the serverless SQL compute is there for too. Like if SQL's the place where you want to live, you can read the data in directly from the data lake there and just use SQL all the time and not have to set up that Spark cluster even. There's, you know, I think some advantages to using Spark, but again, that you're going to pay for what compute you use in both scenarios there. So the last question is sort of about the cost model. Costing is based on DWUs, so that means it'll incur additional charges. So yeah, if you're running a SQL pool for that actual, you know, provisioned SQL Data Warehouse SQL pool, you are going to pay while that's up and running. And yeah, I've had mine up and running for the, you know, since this morning to run this demo, and I'm paying like $3 an hour out of my, you know, I have a MSDN subscription, so I get like a credit, but I'm chipping away at that credit right now. So I'll probably pause it when we're done. But yeah, no, that's it can get costing. Now, just for having the resource as well, there's a monthly fee for just creating it and running the workspace too. All right, I think that the last questions. We'll go ahead and end there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you so much for hosting. As for everybody else, we want to just make sure that you guys know that the recording will be available tomorrow around noon Eastern Standard Time. If you guys have any questions from there to now, please feel free to reach out to Mike or myself. I just know that there was quite a bit of questions. You guys will also receive an email link to the recording, which is on our YouTube channel, as well as any of our past webinars. Thank you guys so much for attending today, and I hope you guys all have a good rest of your Tuesday. Again, Mike, thank you so much for hosting. We appreciate it.
Thanks.